Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the second half of what is turning out to be a really exciting conversation about the use of real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making, particularly with regard to cardiac devices. Our next speaker, Dr. Bob Harrington, needs a little introduction to this audience. I'm going to do it anyway. Dr. Harrington is the Arthur Bloomfield Professor of Medicine at Stanford, where he's the chair of medicine. And to give you the context, this is a 700+ faculty member department, the largest within the School of Medicine. Dr. Harrington, it's hard to overstate his contribution to cardiology over the last 25 years. Not just as the lead at Duke Clinical, as leader of Duke Clinical Research Institute, not only did he implement these large trials that have shaped our thinking, he's actually also shaped how we think about generating new evidence over this period of time. Dr. Harrington, like many of our speakers today, grew up in the area in Somerville, which was really just as cool then as it was now, I'm told, and did his med school at Tufts and his residency at UMass in Worcester, and landed at Stanford by way of DCRI. Dr. Harrington, thank you for joining us today. Looking forward to your plenary talk and then also to your participation in the panel.
Well, thanks for having me. And just for a point of reference, it's Worcester.
I wasn't even going to stop.
All right, my Boston accent will come out the longer I speak, although I haven't lived in Boston in 30 years. Let's see. Here we go. Here's all my disclosures, my research disclosures, my consulting disclosures, and I serve on a couple of boards. So I'm going to try to frame this request around thinking about real-world data, real-world evidence in cardiovascular devices in what I'll call the broader context. And I'm going to just try to ask 3 questions that I'll walk through a series of some examples, some hopefully data-derived opinions. And the first question I'll ask you is, what problem are we trying to solve here today? Then the second is that I'm going to try to really get you to think about this, to focus on the perspectives first of patients and clinicians. What do patients want to know? What do clinicians want to know to inform their patients about their healthcare decisions and choices? I would submit that this should appeal and apply to regulators and payers as well. It doesn't always, but it should. And then I'll talk about the concept of using real-world data to produce real-world evidence. I thought Bill laid it out beautifully this morning as to what the FDA meant by issuing the draft guidance in this topic. So here's the broad context for me, is that society has a real need for evidence. And there's demand for evidence to practice medicine. Our professional society guidelines, particularly in cardiology, where we have the ACC and the AHA guidelines existing for the last 30+ years now, really is a centerpiece of quality metrics in most of our hospitals. There's in all of our health systems an increasing emphasis on using quality to do things like incentivize compensation for individual physicians, for divisions, for departments, et cetera. And there are studies that support the notion that guidelines-based care is associated with better outcomes for those patients with regard to both quality and outcomes. There's also demands for evidence to guide policy. You heard from Dr. Maisel, you heard from Dr. Zuckerman that we're really interested in data to guide regulatory approvals. CMS is interested in data and other payers to guide reimbursement policy. And within this public health space plays out this notion of comparative effectiveness research. It was made reference to this morning, the concept of what is evidence-based medicine. And evidence-based medicine sometimes gets a bad rap, that it's cookbook medicine, that it's following a recipe. But in fact, David Sackett, who originated the concept of evidence-based medicine, working out of Canada many years ago, he never actually said that you should just blindly follow an algorithm. What he said was you should combine the best quantitative evidence on a topic. He didn't say randomized evidence, and he didn't say observational evidence. He said the best evidence available on a topic, combine it with expert judgment in an effort to produce medical care with the highest reproducible quality. That's what he actually said. But it's been interpreted a lot of different ways. And this is a paper that I suspect some of you have seen. It's a very old paper now. And particularly when I talk to my surgical colleagues or I talk to my interventional cardiology colleagues, we stray oftentimes from evidence-based medicine to things like eminence-based medicine. And that is, are you an old person with white hair like me who's delivering a perspective on what we should do? Where the surgeons and interventional cardiologists probably agree is the vehemence-based medicine. You know, damn it, I'm going to put this device in because I know it works. And you can measure the quality of that by how loud they yell at you in the cath lab or in the operating suite. So this is somewhat tongue in cheek, but as they say, not really. There's some truth to this. This is a paper I've used for years, and those of you who have debated with me, Laura having been one over the years, and talked about this this notion of, can we use observational data to make treatment decisions? Should we use randomized data? I like to use this, Deming data and observational studies, and taken from the very first sentence, with some updating from me, is any claim coming from an observational study about treatment comparisons, and that's what I'm going to focus on, is most likely to be wrong. Now, I'm not, just a trialist. I'm a clinical researcher who hopefully uses the best methods available to me when I'm trying to study a clinical problem. And I am interested in clinical problems. As Kazi pointed out, and as Bobby pointed out earlier this morning when I was over at the BI, I did my research training in something called the Duke Data Bank for Cardiovascular Diseases, which is a group that dated back to the 1960s at Duke and really was a place where data scientists, bioinformatics, computer scientists, biostatisticians, epidemiologists came together with clinicians, very similar to what's going on in the Smith Center today, to try to understand how best to use aggregated data to take care of patients. In the 60s, it was really started to look at cardiovascular patients. Subsequently, now the Duke Clinical Research Institute, which is the successor organization of the data bank, is interested in multiple therapeutic areas, but the roots of the data bank and of the DCRI are in cardiology. And this was a paper typical of what was produced at Duke in the 70s and 80s, where they were really, like you, trying to figure out, how do you use non-randomized data to gain causal inference, to understand how you might apply some of these new therapies, bypass surgery, coronary intervention, what was going to be best. And I just, call your attention to the last paragraph where they say these results suggest that carefully performed analysis of observational data can complement the results of clinical trials. And they pointed out, like has been done all morning, that there were holes in the evidence world. There were always going to be holes. There are going to be gaps. There are going to be certain populations, as was pointed out in Sweetheart, that were not studied. And so there's an important role for the two to come together. And I don't want to create, from at least my perspective, this dichotomy of, oh, one's always right, one's always wrong. I think that you have to pick the method that best suits the question and make sure you're using the best methodologies within that method to get the estimate that's most reflective of the truth, which is what we're all interested in. What's the likelihood? And you'll see that there's a lot of famous people in this paper who are still working in the field today. Mark Lackey, who's at Stanford, Rob Califf, who's at the FDA, Frank Harrell, who's at Vanderbilt, Kerry Lee, recently retired, Dan Mark, David Pryor. These are people who really helped to conceptualize a lot of what we're talking about today. A group of us from Duke, from Stanford, from the UK, from other places, from the Brigham, from Germany, tried to lay this out a couple of years ago in a perspective piece that we called Randomized Trials versus Common Sense and Clinical Observation. And this was really making the case for randomized clinical trials and why it was so important. And it's always great to look at all the areas where the observational data matches up with the randomized clinical trial data, but many times it doesn't. This is a partial list. I think I cut the table in two from the observational studies which don't match with the clinical trials observations. And then we have a column at the end here that we talked about the reason. And I thought it was nicely pointed out in the Sweetheart data. There's reasons why they might not match and what some of the issues are about modifiable treatment effect, modifiable treatment parameters. There may be some issues about you misunderstood the pathophysiology of the disease at that particular time. So what I put this up for is not to say one method's better than the other, but in all of the methods we're using, we have to use skepticism and caution. And I'll give you just one example very recently that I talked about this morning in cardiology grand rounds. During the beginning of the COVID epidemic, we were all looking for ways to treat patients. And those of you who particularly were clinicians at the time know that it was an enormously stressful time of trying to figure out this new disease and how to treat people. We had an approach in the UK where they, from 2 weeks into the pandemic, began randomizing people to understand treatment issues. We had a case in the US where it was every man, woman, child for themselves trying to figure out what might work. Little organization amongst warring parties across the United States. And because of that, we did things like this. We administered convalescent plasma to more than 20,000 individuals without any idea other than biologic intuition that it might work. When we finally, and suggested to people along the way that it was saving lives. That's how good this was. When we did the randomized trial of a fraction of that number of patients, about 2,000 patients, we demonstrated that it didn't work. And that there were some aspects of it that in fact might be harmful. So this is just the cautionary tale. So I always like putting this in my talks because Greg Fonarow is a well-known observational researcher who wrote this viewpoint in JAMA Cardiology a few years ago where he said randomization, there is no substitute. And what he really is focused on today in this paper is not that you can't use observational data to do certain things, but it really does have to be thought about as complementary when you want to understand the comparison of A versus B. Now, I asked at the beginning, what problem are you trying to solve? I'd submit that the problem, and I thought Miguel said it beautifully this morning. Well, of course, if we could do the clinical trials and everything we want to do them on, that's what we should do. But this is the problem. This is the trials that I've been involved with. Randomized double-blind trial involving over 20,000 patients conducted over 10 years. Oh yeah, unfortunately, we've forgotten why. And that is part of the issue that Laura pointed this out. Some of the trials are going on for years, and we need an answer now because we're going to take care of patients tomorrow. And so understanding the problem that we're trying to solve, I think this is one of the problems. How do we make clinical trials more efficient, more effective, answer more questions as a society? And I would submit to you that this is a public health issue. Here is a paper that Ellen Antman and I, a viewpoint that we wrote in JAMA about 10 years ago now, where we talked about as large trials became popular, simplicity was lost. And we began to think about, well, what else could we do? Well, maybe we could put our randomization scheme into registries like the ones run by the ACC and AHA. And Elliot and I were very proud of ourselves. We thought this was a great idea. And then we realized, it's been pointed out, that the Swedes were already thinking about it. In fact, the Swedes were going to do it. And so I bring your attention back to this. If you haven't read this classic series of papers by Rob Califf and Dave Demetz, it was in circulation about 20 years ago. I'd submit that you should. It's a several-part series. And one of the great things, and you pull this out, is that there's a lot of basic principles to think about. And one of the things in this paper that I always refer back to is that when one's evaluating therapies, understand that most treatment effects in cardiovascular medicine are modest. Qualitative actions are uncommon, but quantitative actions are very common. Unintended targets happen, maybe less in the device space, more in the drug space. Long-term and short-term effects may differ. Putting things together in combinations can be unpredictable. And the notion of a class effect may not be valid. And so I'd ask, what should we really care about? Well, what I want to know is, are people going to live longer? Do they feel better? Do they avoid unpleasant experiences? Having to go back to the cath lab, back to the operating room, getting hospitalized. If you're thinking from a big picture public policy perspective, you're probably also asking, can we spend less money? Our FDA commissioner has pointed out that now's the time to fix the evidence generation system. And you'll note that if you read through Rob's writings, he never actually says that one thing is better than another. What he largely says is we have a broken system of evidence generation and how we think about it, and what are the parts of it that should be and could be addressed. And he talks a lot about utilizing non-randomized data to make decisions. But when you really want to know something, the power of randomization, it's worth taking a look at the paper. This is not a new debate, right? Going back 30 plus years, the Oxford group, Richard Peto, Rory Collins, they have a series of papers where they say there is simply no serious scientific alternative to the generation of large-scale randomized evidence. The Oxford group has led the world in this. And more recently, they published a sounding board article in the New England Journal. They said the magic of randomization versus the myth of real-world evidence. But what were they getting at? What they're really getting at is not that you can't use observational data to do really important things. but we should do a better job with our trials. A group of us at Duke who've been working in the clinical trial space for over 30 years now have really tried to distill everything we've learned about clinical trials to a handful of things, sort of like a Letterman top 10 list. And here's our top 10 list of really what makes a quality clinical trial. You don't need a lot of the ornaments that often get thrown onto the clinical trial Christmas tree until it ultimately collapses. The classic example is the usual NIH-funded clinical trial, where everybody wants to do their sub-study and their extra biomarker and everything else. And all of a sudden the trial's unwieldy and it's not going to answer the question. Think about what your question is. Does it have these quality indicators? And can you pull it off in an easier way? Again, this is a group of us who have served as the Duke Clinical Research Institute directors over the last 30 years. And we've put forward a notion that, yes, for well-conducted clinical randomized trials, there are things that we have to think about. Some of them are thinking about it from a societal perspective. Some of them are thinking about from an individual trial perspective. But we lay out our thinking on this in this JCI paper, which I hope you'll take a look at. The NIH has talked about this. Mike Lauer has asked the question, can we do more efficient clinical trials? Is it possible? And he lays out, well, there's some things to consider. And guess what? Almost everything on his list is on our list and vice versa, is that we're all thinking about the same things. But as Bill and I have been sidebarring over here, how do you actually do those in the real world, in practice? I think we're at an inflection point here because now a lot of people in positions of influence in society are thinking about this. Then cardiovascular medicine, the ESC, the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, World Heart Federation have said, we can do better than this. And how do we create randomized trials fit for purpose for the 21st century? And it's laid out nicely in this, and there's no surprises here. But one of the things we've got to do is break down this barrier between clinical practice and clinical research. Why have they evolved as these two separate things where never the two shall meet? In fact, they should be completely intertwined. As a patient, as well as a clinician, if I don't know something or if something needs to be done to me that the evidence is uncertain, randomize me. Let's figure out what the answer is. And I believe that passionately. And I do believe that there are some tools to make things better. I think digital technology and our ability to do trials remotely, to collect data in a continuous way, is really going to change the scene. Being able to put devices in people and get constant data coming back about how they're doing is critically important. You can do it for recruitment. You can get consent this way. You can collect novel endpoints. Why are we still using the 6-minute walk? When I wear a watch all day that tells me how far I've been walking all day, all week, all month. Why do we still use things like the 6-minute walk? And can we be more pragmatic in how we do trials? And pragmatism takes on a variety of definitions, but this is a great paper written several years ago now that lays out the essential elements of pragmatism. And trials can be kind of pragmatic to completely pragmatic and everything in between. The Sweetheart trial was talked about. To me, this is one of the great examples of doing a clinical trial. As was pointed out, 60% of the intended subjects were eligible for the trial. But what wasn't pointed out, and I'll remind people, that was 60% of all the heart attacks in Sweden over 2 years. That's extraordinary. Think about that in the United States, if we could do that. We've recently published on a comparative effectiveness pragmatic trial funded by PCORI through PCORNet, where we studied the question of aspirin dosing. Baby aspirin, full adult dose aspirin, 81 milligrams versus 325. You'd say, is that really a question? Yeah, we don't know the answer. And if you look around the country, everybody at different places does different things. It's truly equipoise. And we made this a trial of 15,000 patients completely through the EHR of only 40 centers. We didn't use 1,000 centers to do this clinical trial. We used 40. Now, do we have all the data pieces that we might like to have had? No. We made decisions along the way. The trial was, I would say, mostly, but not completely, a pragmatic design. Other places, as I said, the AHA is talking about this, and the AHA has a big advantage. AHA has some registries, like the Get With the Guidelines Stroke Registry, that captures 90% of the strokes in this country. And investigators like those at the Smith Center, those at Duke, those at Stanford, they've created probabilistic matching with other data sets to take the Get With the Guidelines in hospital data and link it to other data sets, powerful tools. We're now starting to do clinical trials on the backbone of this to try to understand efficiency. So I want to close with just a couple of things. From a societal perspective, one of the things I really think we need a public dialogue on is why this separation of clinical research and clinical practice. Yes, I understand the ethics of clinical research and how it evolved over the last half century plus, 70 years plus, but we're in a different time. And can we ask questions about why do we let doctors just pick things that what they want to do? You know, you can ask 5 doctors what to do, and the joke is you'll get 5 different answers. That horrifies me. Why shouldn't we randomize and get the real answer? Why do we allow doctors to do certain things? And the group at Hopkins in the Hastings Center, they've written eloquently about this, about really, I think, rethink the whole the process of informed consent. Do we actually need informed consent in everything we do? We let doctors choose in some ways willy-nilly. Why aren't we learning from it in a more systematic way? And a question that I asked Dr. Maisel this morning, can we not, as a society, put more and more emphasis on the payers, in this case CMS, actually helping us deliver reliable evidence? Why don't we just pay for more things only if the patient is in a randomized clinical trial or in a large registry? We do some of it, but we don't do it as much as we could. This is a great paper in the New England Journal a few years ago, Evidence for Health Decision-Making Beyond Randomized Clinical Trials. And I like this because, read the last sentence, there is no single best approach to the study of health intervention. Clinical and public health decisions are almost always made with imperfect data. That is certainly true. We learned this during the pandemic, right? Every day we're learning and making decisions on imperfect data. But let's try to get the best quality of evidence that we can and go back to what Sackett really asked us to do. So I've asked the question here, real world data for evidence generation, can only trials tell the truth? And I'll give you my punchline, no. We need both types of work, but we don't as a society have adequate evidence to optimally guide what we're doing. I would submit to you that when the question is understanding treatment differences, especially modest ones, which is most of clinical medicine, randomization is best to get at the actual truth. Observation studies, registries, huge value and offer complementary science. And as Miguel pointed out, hey, we've got huge areas where there's no randomized clinical trials or insufficient clinical trials, as was pointed out. Absolutely. One thing when you talk to the computer scientists, and I live in computer science land of Stanford and Silicon Valley, you go talk to the computer science undergrads, they'll just tell you, oh, if I just have enough data, I can solve this problem. And it doesn't. No matter how much data you have, it doesn't negate the issue of randomization. And finally, what we should be focusing on as a cardiovascular community should be not replacing clinical trials, but improving them. And I think that there's a lot of ways as a society we can improve them, but it's going to require some difficult and challenging conversations. So thanks for having me. And when we finished arguing our opinions today, I actually have randomized data